No, give me a pop-up. It's being recorded, so
Yeah, don't worry.
a game tonight.
Yeah.
All right, so essentially, please feel free to interrupt, ask questions. I would like this to be as useful as possible for the group, rather than me just talk for an hour. So don't worry about interrupting. All right, so I run engineering at Arrive. I've been there just shy of 7 years. I have been doing software development for 18 years now. So I've hired a lot of people, have worked through interviewing a lot of people, had to fire some people, but we've taken a very methodical approach as to how we hire, what we look for, how we look to identify candidates we believe will be successful. And I think those are fairly universal things when you think about interviewing. So the goal of every interview is to assess, do we think this person will be successful here, right? And there's a lot of variables that go into that. But at its core, as we interview, we're looking for 3 broad categories, right? So we're trying to identify general problem-solving ability. How do you approach a challenge? What sort of questions do you ask? How do you break down large problems into smaller problems? How do you pick what piece to tackle first, what piece to tackle second? How do you adapt if things don't go as planned? Are you coming up with novel solutions? Are you going through things you already know? Like, these are all just how do you approach and solve a problem. At its core, software engineering is effectively problem solving, right? So the goal of the technical interview is to assess how do you approach and break down a problem. Second thing we're looking for is technical proficiency. So when we do coding challenges, we allow candidates to choose their tools, right? So if you know Java, write Java. If you know Ruby, write Ruby. If you know Python, write Python. It's not challenging to teach someone a new language or a new framework if they can demonstrate appropriate levels of aptitude. And so we generally want people to be using a language they're comfortable in, at which point they should be able to demonstrate their general level of proficiency. What are you devising readable, reasonably well-organized solutions, or are you all over the place? Do you spend 45 minutes coming up with a framework and not actually make any meaningful progress? So how effectively do you work in the thing that you purport to know? And the last thing we're really trying to assess is related around kind of teamwork and personality. So how do you interact and communicate with the person you're interviewing with? Are you taking initiative? Are you asking questions? Are you just kind of sitting there and waiting? Do you ask for help? If the interviewer is talking to you, do you listen, right? A lot of times you will get information from people who are interviewing you. It's not because they just like to hear themselves talk, right? And so are you receiving that? Are you thinking about it? Are you incorporating that into your solution? Are you asking questions? At the end of the day, we're trying to assess what's it like to work with this person, and is this someone that we want to work with, which is inherently somewhat challenging. So we'll kind of walk through those things a bit. And again, feel free to stop and ask questions. So preparing for the technical interview, this is one of the more challenging things, right? So generally in technical interviews, you're going to get various types of questions. Like sometimes you're just going to get rote algorithmic questions, right? And you're like, oh, I know this is a depth first search, and so that's what I'm going to do. I don't really like those because you either know them or you don't. And if you don't, like, well, all right, this is going to be annoying. And if you do, it doesn't really tell me anything about your ability to function in your job. You might get trick questions. Trick questions are awful. No one should ask them anymore. These were really popular like 15 years ago, but everyone's kind of pivoted off of that. So if anyone ever asks you, like, how many windows are in New York City, or if you got shrunk to the size of an ant, how would you get out of a blender? Like, these are just dumb questions no one should ask anymore, but you might run into them. The other 2 general types of questions that you'll probably get are questions that seem really easy, but have very interesting complexities to them as you work through them, and questions that seem really hard, but aren't actually that easy. aren't actually that hard, right? So these are both questions that require you to stop and think about what is the problem that I'm solving, what are the details here, to engage with the interviewer and work through what sort of solution am I going to build, and then kind of bring that to life, whether it's via a shared session. Before we could, when we could be face-to-face, we do whiteboard stuff. But it's generally meant to assess how are you solving this problem and what do you like to work with. So a lot of this boils down to pattern recognition. So if you're early in your career and uncertain about what buckets do certain things fall into, repetition is super helpful here. There's a lot of resources that cover this. If you're into like, how do I classify different types of problems, Cracking the Coding Interview is actually a really great book that dives into this, and it breaks down the individual sections and gives you a bunch of problems. People like to use, HackerRank and Project Euler. Like, these are just math and algorithm-based questions. Like, feel free to do them, right? At the end of the day, if you're applying for a React role, or you're applying for a Rails role or a Python role, literally Google interview questions for these roles. Unless it's a large company, there's a reasonable chance the person interviewing you is doing the same. These are the thematic ideas and things about the stack that you should know, right? The more you do this, the more comfortable you're going to be doing it. And I think one of the big challenges as you get into technical interviews is you hear a question and you think, I've got an idea. And then you run into a roadblock. And it's very hard at that point for a lot of people to just stay calm and take a step back and reassess. Similarly, if you get a question that sounds really difficult and go, oh God, I have no idea how to solve this. You're not going to get any problems that require you to have a PhD to solve. You're not going to get problems that are overly difficult, or you shouldn't for entry-level roles. If you do, the person interviewing you is terrible. Hopefully you don't run into that. But staying calm and taking a step back and assessing, like, what are you trying to do, is really, really important here. And if you can invest some time in working through some of these problems and identifying some of these patterns and just getting used to reading a problem and stepping back and going, what am I actually trying to do here, right? Like, words aside, like, what is the problem domain? What am I assuming? What can I not assume? Like, start to ask those questions and get used to going through that exercise. It will help dramatically as you go through this process. So interviews themselves are a bit challenging in software engineering, principally because you either end up with a recruiter. No offense to James. James is our recruiter. James is a great recruiter. James doesn't know all of the technical nuances, right? So James doesn't do any of our technical screening and anything like that. There are companies where they have a recruiter doing technical screening. Generally speaking, those folks have a question and an answer sheet, and you've got to match it up. Those aren't amazing experiences. Similarly, when you get into the on-site interview experience, you might get people who are great at interviewing. You might get engineers that get thrown in a room. This is something that we've invested a lot of time in, is making sure everyone on our team interviews, making sure that everyone is comfortable being in that room, because as someone interviewing, it's very easy to feel nervous, and it's very easy to wonder, am I doing a good job? There's a strong likelihood, unless the person interviewing you has done many, many interviews, they feel exactly the same way. And so we spend a fair bit of time with all of our engineers, getting them involved in this process, helping them understand what does it take to be a good interviewer, right? So don't go into the interview assuming the person interviewing you knows what they need to do to get the best impression of you, to understand your skill set, to understand how you communicate. If they do, fantastic, even better. Often that's not necessarily the case. And so the things that you can do here that are probably most effective is be open and clear about communication. As someone who's interviewing, it is utterly useless for me to give you a problem to solve And whether we're remote or in person, have you sit in silence for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes, and just nothing is happening. I don't understand your train of thought. I don't understand if you have a question, if you're uncertain of what we're trying to do. It's really hard for me to get a good picture of what are your capabilities, where are you as a candidate, are you someone that we could invest in who could grow? And so as someone who is being interviewed, it is exceedingly helpful if I interview someone and they take the problem and take a step back and think about the solution and talk about, like, okay, here's what I think I'm trying to solve. Here's how I'm going to try to approach it, right? That communicates to me, here's how you're starting to break this problem down. Here's how you're trying to form a solution. If I see you're way off base, that gives me an opportunity to say, oh, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about this scenario, right? It allows us to have that conversation and make sure we're headed down the right path. The entire process of that interview is important. The solution at the end is a tiny bit. If you don't finish the solution, but we were on the right track and we just ran out of time, I could not care less, right? Like, I got all the information I need from that process. If you say nothing and get a solution that's 75% complete when you come to the end, it's very difficult for me to make an assessment. And so making sure that you're going out of your way to communicate, here's what I think you're asking me to solve. Here's what I believe the requirements are. Here are my assumptions. If you're not sure if you can assume something, ask, right? Like that, this is what your everyday job will be, right? And so if you want to make an assumption, if you're rock solid confident, state it. If you're unclear, ask the person interviewing you. It is their responsibility to clarify that. If you have multiple approaches in mind, talk about those, right? Like, if you think of 2 ways to solve a problem and you're not sure which path to go as an interviewer, I'd love to spend 3-4 minutes talking about that, and let's pick the path forward that we think might have the best chance for success or would be more interesting. Similarly, if you start writing code and you get stuck at some point, you've got a solution in mind, you're going, and either something doesn't work out as you thought it would, or you lose your train of thought, you're not sure where to go, talk about it. Like, it's okay to articulate that and to bring that up, because again, as an interviewer, I can see where we're going, I see where you're stuck, and I should be able to help you get past that, right? If you stand in silence, though, I have no idea what's going on. As the interviewer, I should be asking you at this point, right? Like, what are you thinking about? What's going on here? If you're getting those prompts, the person wants to know. Like, they want to understand your thought process. They want to understand where you're stuck. These are opportunities to unstick yourself and communicate to that interviewer where you are in this process, right? Similarly, if you have a solution, but you're thinking, wow, this is a really inefficient solution, it is perfectly fine to say that. It is perfectly fine to say, we can solve this way. It's really inefficient, right? But I'm going to go down this path so we can get something done, and then we'll talk about how we can make it more efficient after that. That gives me the chance as an interviewer to say, great, let's do that. Or no, let's not do the really inefficient solution. Let's talk about how we can make it more efficient and explore that solution. I've done a number of interviews where people get stuck in their own head, where they have a solution, but it's not great. They know it could be better, and they sit and they think and they spin and they spin and they spin, and they're trying to come up with something clever and super efficient, and we never actually get into any sort of meaningful solutioning, which then gives me no insight into how do you solve problems and how do you communicate and how do you work. And so it's okay to get an imperfect solution. It's okay to get something functional but inefficient. Acknowledge that. Talk about it, right? Like, the interview process is very much a 2-way process in that regard. And you're going to put yourself in the best position to be fairly evaluated if you're actively communicating throughout that process. The one caveat there is, obviously don't create ridiculous solutions, right? Like don't try to manually map every permutation you can think of. Like that's not a real solution. But so big takeaway from the 8 minutes, 10 minutes of talking there is the entire part of that technical interview process is an evaluation. It's not just the code and it's not just the solution. The code and the solution are important, right? But if you write great code and you have great solutions, but you are unbearable to talk to and work with, we're not going to hire you, right? The person interviewing you is thinking about that from not only how can I fill this role, but how does this person fit on the team and how do they grow and what do they bring to the company and the culture? And I can't bring someone in who is really abrasive and challenging to work with, even if they're really smart and even if they bring forth good solutions. That's challenging. You've got to have the right environment for that. And so no solution is terrible, right? But a 50% complete solution where you've articulated to me how you solve a problem and how you think about it and how you devise a solution, and we were able to work through perhaps where you got stuck somewhere and I can see where you were going, like that's someone I can evaluate and say, okay, how do they communicate? How are they to work with? How do they fit in the team? If we support them, how can they grow? Like where are they at today, right? And how can we help them grow? And so the crux of all of that is active communication, which is easier the more you do these interviews and the more you put yourself in that situation. And so if you can take one thing away, and I would say it should be try to be calm and try to take a step back and remember that it's the entirety of that process and be an active communicator, right? Like the solutions will come. Like you guys are learning to write code, you're learning to build solutions, like that will be okay. The communication bit is where I think often people lose focus. And that's really unfortunate because really good candidates just freeze up. And then you're not really painting that picture of yourself that you want, right? Like you're not allowing that employer to see what are you like to actually work with on a day-to-day basis, not in this interview setting. So try to demonstrate that, try to communicate. That will serve you well. So the other bit of interviewing we do is we do a work history interview. You'll get work history interviews. These are a little bit challenging early in the career, but when we think about work history, I'm not amazingly concerned with what exactly did you do. Like I want to understand your role. I want to understand what you did, your time at that company. But what we're looking for is, do you have a history of demonstrated success? Right? Whatever you did, were you successful in doing it? What made you successful? Right? Were you engaged? Did you seek out opportunity and create opportunity, or did you just show up to work every day and after 18 months got bored? Along that line, do you demonstrate growth over time, right? And so whatever your role is, if you were somewhere for 3 years, did you do the same job for 3 years? Did your responsibilities change over that time? What drove that growth, right? Was that something that you sought out and created opportunities for? Was it something that fell in your lap? Similarly, are you introspective? Right? Do you understand that the skill set you have today is not the skill set you had 8 years ago, hopefully 3 years ago, 2 years ago? You should be growing, right? You should be pushing to find new things and find opportunities to contribute. And the last thing we're trying to suss out in that work history interview is what keeps you engaged in a position? Like, what are you looking for? So when the cost of hiring the wrong person is really high, it takes a lot of time and effort to hire someone. It takes time to ramp them up. You've got to educate them on your tech stack. You've got to educate them on your business. It's a massive investment, right? So I don't want to hire someone who's going to be here for 6 months or 8 months or 12 months. Like I want to hire people that we can invest in and grow. And so understanding what engaged you in your previous roles, why did you look for new opportunities?
Did he freeze or is that just me?
He's frozen on my end as well.
Yeah, same. Joshua, can you hear us? Maybe we lost
you to change positions over time. That's an important bit there. And I would encourage you to be very honest about that, because the interview process for you should be an equal assessment of the company that you're evaluating. Your time is finite, right? The effort you can provide is finite. And so ideally you find an opportunity where you can learn and grow. You can continue to develop your skills, and you're not 6 months later realizing this is going nowhere and trying to find something else again. So in that scenario, I would absolutely encourage you to be honest. I'd much rather get to the end of an interview and realize, hey, it's not a good fit, right? And we're both on the same page there, than hire someone and 60 days in, we both realize this was a giant mistake on everyone's part. No one wins in that scenario, right? So as we go through that process, like we try to ask those questions and try to suss that out and try to be open and honest about this is the opportunity we provide. This is the work environment that we provide. These are the expectations that we have for individual engineers to allow candidates to make that decision as well. So like that's the 24-minute spiel. Questions, clarifications? I'm happy to go into detail about anything here.
I know you said communication was kind of one of the things that stood out. It seems like you have a lot of experience interviewing. Is there anything that like other than just like good communication skills and things like that really stood out, or anything in particular that set someone above? Because I know some of the interviews we're going to be going against tons of other candidates, and just like what is something that like, okay, this person stands out above the drone of other people?
So stands out is a good question. I think for me, the things, so I don't want to sit and have someone talk and it's just dribble, right? Like you don't have to tell me, I'm going to define an integer and I'm going to set it to 0 and I'm going to write a for loop. Like that's not the communication that's useful. I think the big things for me would be, especially for someone early in their career. So the tendency for everyone early in their career is to read a problem and immediately go, I know how to fix this, and immediately start writing code. This is common for folks 2, 3 years, 4 years experience. Like they still just, they see a solution and immediately hone in and start execution. The challenge here is you read it one way and you made assumptions, and then you're immediately solving for a problem containing all the assumptions that you made without ever clarifying if they're correct. And so this is how you end up with short-sighted solutions, or 80% done, and all of a sudden you've got to rewrite a whole bunch of stuff because it doesn't work for 20%. And so I think for me, the big bits to try to call out there is taking that step back at the beginning, articulating your understanding of the question being asked, articulating your assumptions, asking for clarifications, asking about other potential assumptions, like really demonstrating how you approach the problem and how you want to make sure that you're driving toward the right solution, not just a solution where you've assumed 35 things. So that to me would be a pretty significant thing, because you don't see that very frequently with folks who haven't done really, really meaningful independent work. And for 3 or 4 years. Like that's generally a learned skill that gets hammered into people much later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any really good questions that someone interviewing a junior dev could try to ask the interviewer that either like, I don't want to say like, oh wow, that's like an impressive question, but like something is a really important question that you can try to ask potential employers?
Yeah, so one of the things that I don't do, so as an interviewer, I'm going to ask questions, right? I'm going to ask you questions about what are you looking for in your next role, and all sorts of things in this vein. Because what I want to understand is, what are you looking for? What are you really looking for that interests you? Don't give horrible tailored answers that are just like permutations of the description of the role. It is almost always super transparent and really frustrating, because I actually want a true statement here, not pandering. Like, we called you in an interview because we think we might want to hire you. You don't have to pander in the interview. For questions to ask, I would say identify the things that are important to you and ask about those things. So early in your career, right? I'm going to make some assumptions here, but ideally, you want to find a situation where there's some more senior engineers who you can work with and learn from. You want to be able to work on meaningful things, right? You don't want to just get tiny bug tickets and only work really tiny bug tickets. Like, ask the interviewer. If you're interviewing with engineers, ask the engineers. If you're interviewing with folks that lead these departments, ask them as well, right? Like, everyone should give you, in theory, answers that jive with one another. But identify the situations about the opportunity that are important to you to grow, right? Because for me as an employer, I want to hire people I can grow and retain, right? And so if you're asking me questions about what do those opportunities look like for growth, and recognize that as someone early in their career, like, I have opportunities to grow and I'm looking for that. You know, what's there to help me? There are places who do pair programming constantly, right? We don't. There are places that will give gigantic projects that they should never give to junior engineers and not give them support, right? And so probing into those things that are important to you, and with real meaningful questions, right? And I don't mean to be like vague about that, but that's going to kind of vary depending on what's important to you. But things like team size. If you're on a team of 50 engineers and you have one lead engineer responsible for all 50 of those engineers, the likelihood that that lead is going to be able to provide you with real one-on-one mentorship or growth is probably pretty low, right? So maybe that's important to you. If they have 50 engineers, how do they structure those 50 engineers? Do they all work on the same project? Do they have smaller teams that get broken out? Like, what does that look like? Those are the kind of questions that, for me, indicate you're actually interested in joining this organization and this team and not just looking for a job.
Thank you.
All right, all the videos are frozen, so I didn't know if I'd been talking to no one for a period of time.
No, we could hear you.
Okay, fantastic.
Just been talking in the void this whole time.
You never know, right? Like, they just all froze, and it's like, well, either everyone heard me or that was like a 5-minute spiel to nobody. So
you did freeze up for a couple minutes a while back.
Oh man. All right. Sorry about that.
No, it fast forwards when you do start talking again, so it catches us up quick. So
All right. Anything else? Questions? I will answer any question you have. Technology questions.
I was
anything.
talk with my partner today about like competitor interviews where she was like sitting in the same room with other people competing for the same position, and they were like asking everyone like the same question. They were answering it. Is that common in tech? She works over in like the IT side.
I have never done that, nor have I seen that anywhere I've worked.
It sounded pretty crazy to me too.
I'm not sure how you would do that from a tech. Like, why wouldn't everyone just steal the first guy's answer if it's a good answer?
And if it's bad, then you can look, like it's just bad all around.
Yeah,
It doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, no, I've not heard that. If you get in that position, I don't know.
Deal.
Don't go
Okay.
first, I guess. But
It
Hey,
feels,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it feels like that's set up to like test teamwork or making sure you don't tear other people down or something like that. Or that's the only thing I could think of with that.
yeah, that's a bit weird.
Hey, so when you're making a decision of whether to hire someone, right? It seems to me that it kind of boils down to that what you were saying of do I want to work with this person and how technically competent are they? Do you kind of weight one of those more than the other? If you find someone that you really love to sit down and work with, but they're lower on the technical scale or higher on one versus the other, like do you weight those kind of evenly 50-50, or where do you fall on that?
So this is going to depend greatly on the need we have at the time. So we have been in instances where we needed to hire a senior engineer who knew Rails, who could step in and contribute day one. For that hire, I need someone who's highly proficient in Rails, who's going to be able to step into these applications and be a contributor very, very rapidly. And so in that instance, I'm going to put more value on demonstrated technical proficiency, right? That is generally the exception when we hire, though. Outside of that, I'm generally going to bias toward the people who, one, there's a baseline technical proficiency. Like, let's assume everyone's hit the baseline, right? If everyone's hit the baseline, and I have a candidate who, I'll use a real world example, right? We hired a woman, she was coming out of consulting. She had a year and a half of experience. In that year and a half, she had worked only in .NET. We don't do any .NET. We do Ruby and we do Go on the back end, and then JavaScript on the front end, right? So it's all React. She had experience in 0% of our technical stack. But during that year and a half, she'd been thrown on like 4 different projects, ramped up on what they were doing, was very successful, wanted to get out of consulting, super easy to work with, great interview. We made her an offer the same day. That was 4 years ago. She's still with us. She's doing great. She just got promoted to senior engineer. But it was one of those scenarios where it's like she literally has no experience in anything we do, but her technical interviews went really well. She has a clear history of being thrown around into unfamiliar situations, ramping up quickly and being successful. And real easy to talk to, real easy to work with. The engineers she interviewed with had nothing but positive things to say about communication. Like, that person I want to bring on the team and give challenging opportunities to and facilitate growth, right? Because that's a person that I believe I can invest in, and everyone's gonna win here. She's gonna grow and get better faster, which means I now have someone really pleasant on the team who's a much stronger engineer much more rapidly. That's generally how we bias our hiring. Every once in a while, though, like, we do get in a crunch. It's like, I need a very specific skill set that can start to contribute right now. And so on our core team, we had opened up 2 roles. One of our roles we hired was a woman who, she lived up in Kenosha and used to work for Chase. And they were going to make her commute to Chase downtown. And she's like, I'm going to find something new because that's a long train ride. She had no experience in Rails, no experience in the tech stack. We brought her on. She's doing very well. But the second role we're hiring for that team now, like, we need a more senior engineer. Like, we we've got to be honest about our bandwidth and our ability to mentor someone and bring them along. Like, we don't have the bandwidth to bring someone else in to that role who doesn't have experience in that stack, right? Like, we don't have the resources to invest and still deliver that business value. And so for that second role, we've got to target somebody with that knowledge. Now, when we're interviewing people, we're really upfront about that, right? Because we have found candidates through the process that it's like, hey, I'm going to be honest, like right now, we don't have the time and ability to ramp someone up and make them successful who doesn't know this stack. That's a resume that I want to keep on file. And if we get a role and an opportunity open up, I want to reach out to that person and find out if they're still interested. But I don't want to bring them on and not be in a position to support them, right? Again, the cost of hiring the wrong person's high. And so if we bring someone in, we want to make sure we're in a position to support their learning of the tech stack and learning of the business and put them in a position to be successful. And so we do, this has happened a few times over the years where it's like a right person, wrong time type scenario where, you know, we may have started the interview process and had, you know, enough bandwidth and enough time, and over 6 weeks, 8 weeks, as we go through that process, things change, right? New opportunities emerge from a business development standpoint. And now all of a sudden our needs for that role change. Like, now I don't have the luxury of dedicating that time. And so we may have interviews or people in the pipeline that were strong candidates, but now it's perhaps not a great fit because we can't dedicate that time to them.
Awesome. Thank you.
I had a question. So specifically, you were talking about Ruby on Rails, and you know, hypothetically, some of us may have an interview coming up with Ruby on Rails, even though that's not in our tech stack. So it's a very similar situation. Is there anything in a week's time, a week and a day actually time, when a few of us have these interviews? Is there anything you would suggest as far as Ruby on Rails specifically, as far as getting prepared for that, maybe looking things up? I know it's kind of similar to Python, and a lot of us are experienced with Python, and then. Because I was also looking into Ruby specifically versus Ruby on Rails, and like what a entry-level developer without familiarity into that going into an interview for Ruby, the stack, how you go about doing that.
So this is challenging, right? There's nothing you're going to learn in a week that's going to be super meaningful to complete a whole interview in Rails. So like Rails as a framework just has like a lot of magic stuff it does. It's a huge amount of extensions on top of Ruby. Like, even if you know Ruby, there's still a lot of Rails stuff, right? So if you don't know Ruby or Rails, there's nothing you're going to learn in a week or a week and a half, barring you committing 10 hours a day to, you know, just trying to grind through it. And even then, it's going to be hard, right? You are much better served being like, I would say, take time and look at the framework, right? Understand generally how it works. Like, we hired a guy who came from the .NET world. And so if you look at the .NET world and the implementations, so the classic MVC framework in .NET has separation at every layer. So your data repository fetches data from the database. It has an interface that communicates with a service layer. Like, everything has separation of concerns. Rails, on the other hand, tightly couples the database schema to the models. Completely different paradigm. He got into this environment and loathed it. It actively made him miserable because he didn't even understand how it could work. And what do you mean you make a change in the database and now all the models change? You have to change all the code that references it. That was like 2015, 2016. We learned our lesson. Anyone who hasn't done anything in Rails, like, you need to go look at Rails. Like, let's make sure you're going to be comfortable in this environment. So I'd say take some time, familiarize yourself generally with how it works. You can spin up a sample Rails app pretty quickly. You can do some database migrations. Like, there are tutorials to walk through all of that. Outside of that, it does you no good to say, I'm familiar with Rails. And then when we get in the interview, you have to Google basic syntax, right? Like, this is a thing that happens. We've had folks who say they're expert in Rails who can't manually traverse an array. They're Googling it. And it's like, I now have to look at everything you did through a different lens because you're clearly lying about your experience here, or you think I am an expert and you know this much, right? And so how's this, again, let's go back to what's it going to be like to work with this person, right? So looking at a, an entry-level role or a role where they're looking for, people early in their career, I expect to teach you things. I expect you to come in and work with more senior engineers and learn and ramp up. If you are honest on your resume and throughout that process, that like, hey, I've looked at Rails, I spun up a sample app, right? But I don't really have any experience in Rails or really in Ruby. As an interviewer, it's on me to assess, like, am I okay with that? If I'm not okay with that, I should have made it a hard requirement in the job posting that you have 1+ years or 2+ years of Rails experience, right? So my advice would be honest, right? Don't kill yourself and try and learn in a massive framework and pass it off like you have experience, because more than likely you're gonna hit things you don't remember or you're not familiar with. To someone who knows Rails or knows any framework, they're gonna immediately see through this facade of I have experience doing this thing, and that doesn't look good in the interview process, right? Like that is one of the things that will actively detract from you as a candidate, right? Whereas being honest about, hey, I've taken a look at Rails, I built a sample project, like seems pretty nice to work with, like you can have some conversations about that, but I don't have any, I don't really have much experience working in Rails. That'd be my advice.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to like something, let's say something did have like a hard requirement that some sort of technology. What is that like? It feels to me very subjective, right? Like at what point are you like experienced with the technology? Like, how do you even judge that necessarily? Because obviously you can learn anything for forever, right? You could really become a perfect master at something, but that's probably more than what they're mostly referring to.
Yeah. So, sorry, 1 second here. My wife is texting me with the kids about dinner, so I don't mean to interrupt, but. Okay. So generally when we are putting in, so you're going to run into 2 sets of job postings. You're going to run into the set of job postings that's aspirational, where they put in a bunch of things that aren't requirements. If they put in a job ad, 2+ years of Python experience, for example, and you have no Python, but you applied for the job and they call you to interview, they read your resume. They know you don't have any Python experience. That's very likely an aspirational thing. And what they're evaluating is, he doesn't know Python, but we could teach him some Python, right? If it's truly a hard requirement, and I put in there, 4+ years of Rails. When I put in 4+ years of Rails, I expect you to be super comfortable working in Rails. Many facets of it. I expect you to be able to talk about kind of the inner workings of that framework. You've used the ORM quite a bit. You've built data migrations, right? Like what I'm really trying to get at is, I don't want somebody who just learned Rails or who has only worked in Rails for a short period of time. I need someone with really solid experience. If you see like 1+ years of Rails experience, they're effectively saying you have to know some Rails. You have to have worked in it in a professional capacity somehow, right? And that might be you've built and maintained, a couple projects for, a couple years, right? You should be able to speak to that. But it is an imperfect measure of the general level of experience, if they have it as a hard requirement, that they're looking for in that role, which goes into what they expect you to be able to contribute, pretty quickly. And so if you think about first 30, first 60, first 90 days on the job, what is the expected level of contribution from a person entering that role, right? Like as someone who's looking into those roles, you should be asking that question, right? Like what is the expectation? If the expectation is you're going to learn this entire framework and all of the business logic and be contributing in 30 days, it's a pretty steep ask, right? Like realistically. And so if you're not familiar with the framework or the technology and they're still interviewing you, that means they're open to bringing you on board, whether you have that experience or not. You should try to understand what their expectation will be in that environment. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What are the questions y'all have?
Yes. So we just got our interview, I don't know, schedules for next week for the people who are doing the apprenticeship program. What would you say would be on a teamwork interview?
He's frozen.
Oh, good. I thought it was me. Well, not.
So they'll just ask you like, how is it like working on a team? Just like basic teamwork questions.
Some communication, like they're trying to find what is it like to work with you. It might be a pair programming interview. They might be asking you theoretical questions. I don't know, but would be my guess.
Thanks. You cut out during the beginning of that, but I think it.
All right. I blame Comcast.
Good policy.
What I have a question, Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of like either like coder bite challenges or like take home challenges for like a week long type of to gauge someone's technical ability?
Personal opinion, I hate them. So we tried them in like 2014. I didn't like them then. I don't like them now. Here's why. So one, I think it's an unbelievable ask of a candidate to put when people like spend no more than 8 hours. 8 hours. That is a lot of time to spend on something, right? Similarly, I don't think it helps me assess the things I care about. If I give you something to take home and you have effectively infinite time and resources, you can solve a problem. You can brute force your way to a solution. You can go on Stack Overflow and ask questions and copy other people's responses and build off of them. Like it doesn't actually help me assess the things I care about, which is how do you solve problems and what is it like to work with you, and like what is your general level of aptitude. And so I know this is a thing at other companies. People do ask for candidates to complete take-home assignments. Their goal is to look at what sort of solution did you build? How did you structure your code? Is it readable? Is it commented? Is it tested? Like all these permutations of like, if you were to write code at work, what would you do? To me, that's a flawed way to do that, because when you're at work, all your code goes through pull PRs, right? So everything goes through a pull request and code review. If you didn't write tests, you don't get approved, your stuff can't move on, right? Like culturally, those things are enforced. We don't throw a junior developer out on an island and go, figure it out, man. You better write great code that's well tested. So I don't love them. We don't use them. They are a thing though. And if you get them, good luck, do your best. I don't know. As someone late in his career, if someone asked me to do that, I'd walk away from the opportunity. But that's where I'm probably over dogmatic and not pragmatic enough. So,
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
For junior or entry level roles, or I guess any role in general, there's all these websites where you can practice, algorithm questions and just general technical interview question practice. So for like entry level roles, is there kind of a like baseline level where if you can do certain, I guess, like difficulty where you would feel fairly confident, like for entry level roles, I guess, like if you were like a junior with your current knowledge, I guess, like, does that make sense? Sorry, it's kind of a roundabout way of asking
so
that.
So let's separate a few things here, which I think are probably useful. So in the realm of computer science, right, there's like 4 things that are really helpful. Your algorithms, right? So this is one of the first classes you take in a CS degree, right? Is algorithms and data structures. This is actually a super useful core competency, right? What data structure you choose and why is actually important. If you don't have any familiarity with this, MIT, I think, puts these courses online for free. This is a really useful one to invest in, right? Like you learn really, really strong concepts. You learn about data structures, the underlying like actual memory layout of these data structures. Like, why should I use an array over a hash map? Like, what are the actual differences between these? That's useful. Taking an RDBMS course is useful. Like if you're going to be doing backend work with databases, understanding how a database server actually breaks a query down into a query plan is helpful over time. Like these are good things to learn. That your first level of discrete math is so you can do runtime analysis. That's actually really useful, right? Those are all skills though that those are really valuable to me if I'm looking for like a backend engineer, for example, who I know is going to have to dive into stuff like that eventually, right?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I got a question.
Yeah.
What did you say? You called it like a BRD or what was it to study?
RDBMS.
Awesome. Thank you.
Relational database. Yeah. So I basically run through like, hey, if you were to build a database server, what would you do? That's useful. So for certain roles, like demonstrating that level of proficiency and understanding is helpful because you're going to get into those things that are hairy and require that sort of computational analysis, right? So when we talk about, we generate rates for parking, right? Which sounds easy, but it's surprisingly complex. And so we have a distributed system where there's bits that do IO things and bits that do math things. And that's where these data structures and algorithms concepts become really, really important as we look to shave response time down. So if we're hiring for that team, we're going to bias toward people who have that fundamental knowledge. Demonstrating that is positive. On the other side, for our React engineers, this skill set is less utilized. If you have it, fantastic. But I would much more prefer to have someone who knows React as a framework better and how to leverage those tools. And so to answer your original question, it depends. Depends on the role, depends on what I'm looking for in that role when I bring that person in as a junior engineer. So it's not bad to know. I would encourage you to, the courses are free. They're going to be really valuable for the rest of your career. You don't have to go get a CS degree, but there are some core things that will prove to be useful for you.
You said that there were 4, just like naming wise. What were the other 3, like algorithms?
Yeah, so data structures and algorithms I kind of loop together. And then discrete math. So this is where you get into that big O notation. So runtime analysis, you start to get into logical reasoning, reasoning by induction, like those types of things. That will be useful as you build more complex solutions, especially as you start to run into performance issues and performance bottlenecks. Like being able to break some of these things apart and understand where should I focus my time is useful. And then the last one is just databases. So an RDBMS class or something like that. But again, leverage free resources. These aren't required, especially for like if you want to go do React or you want to go do Vue or Angular or something. It's not a necessary thing day one, but I would encourage you to invest in continuing to learn, because those will be valuable things that, I did those things in 2002, right? Like these are still valid concepts 19 years later. Like they're going to continue to remain valid. So, and I think nowadays probably getting some design patterns is good. Everybody wants to know about design patterns. Like, what do you prefer? You want to use dry, MVC, MVVM? Like having an understanding of what are those design patterns and what should you leverage when is probably useful as well.
Awesome. Well, we're almost at the hour. If you have any more questions, feel free to Slack myself. If I don't know if Josh is on Slack, but if he's not, I'll invite him to the channel, and you can ask me questions and I'll forward them on to Josh and James. But yeah, I greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, and hope everyone starts preparing for the technical interview process. Yeah. One book
thanks
I
for having
find.
me.
Yep. Yeah, appreciate it.
Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, just one book that I found really useful is like that Cracking the Coding interview book. It's on Amazon. It's like $20. It covers everything, and
it's a good book because you can leaf through and be like, all right, I feel really confident about this set of solutions. Let me skip ahead to the next set of concepts, and it helps a lot with that pattern recognition because they're reframing the same types of problems many different ways. Yeah, that's a good book. I've had that book for a long time. It's quite a good book.
Yeah, especially if you're not like that familiar with data structures. That they've got a really good data structure section, as well as like problem solving, utilizing those data structures to solve interesting problems. Awesome.
So are you the people that taught parking meters 3 blocks from the stadium to charge $30 during a Vikings game?
Yeah, we got to do the calculations. Get ready. Everyone's move now is dynamic pricing, and so they want to charge you more as the lot fills up, which I'm sure is going to be a hit, just a real hit with customers.
I was
going to drive up, and now it's $60 because there's only 5 spots left, right?
This is a parking meter at the curb.
There is. They also want to move to dynamic pricing, so it'll be interesting.
Hi, Joshua. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and we'll send those questions. All right.
All right. Good luck, everybody.